Hello and welcome to my FinTech Founder Firesides. Today I'm talking about the design phase of the product journey, and joining me is Nina from Bloom Money. Nina's currently in the design phase of her product journey, building a financial services proposition for good and giving access to fair credit and tools to build a healthy financial life. Hello, Nina.
Hello.
Hey.
Thank you so much for having me.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's nice and warm. The sun is out. I cannot complain. And yourself?
Yeah, very well, thank you. So before we get into it, you give a brief intro about yourself for anyone who doesn't know you, and like a nice succinct description about Bloom Money and what it is, what it's all about, what customers it's serving, and why it exists.
Yes, of course. So a little background on me. I'm Nina, Silicon Valley native, but have been living abroad for most of my adult life. And I kind of fell into fintech is the way that I describe it. I needed a job and desperately was applying for anything while I was doing my master's. And someone said, "Hey, have you considered MasterCard?" And I thought MasterCard was a bank back then. It's obviously not. And that was a very fortuitous and serendipitous time for me to join MasterCard, because that was the summer when things were really kicking off with UK FinTech, where we had Monzo, actually Monzo was Mondo as a prepaid card. Revolut was on the MasterCard start path. Starling was still in alpha. So it was a super exciting time. And that is really where I fell in love with fintech. And since then, I've had the opportunity to work at some really great companies, including Starling Bank, Bud, the open banking platform, and most recently Klarna, which I recently left to start Bloom. And Bloom Money is a financial platform. We provide financial services to migrants and refugees here in the UK to start, but hopefully in other markets in our journey. And Bloom Money was built primarily because we saw that there was a gap. I think from the moment I mentioned that I fell in love with fintech, I was very enamored with the idea that, wow, we can use technology to better people's financial lives. And that was really, really compelling to me. But I think over the years, I have been not disappointed, but I think that we have kind of missed out on some of the potential for fintech to really help the people that could benefit the most from technology. And so Bloom really wants to serve those that are often overlooked by traditional players, whether that's incumbents or even now fintech companies that might be considered a bit incumbent as well.
Right, thanks for that. So I suppose you kind of touched on it, but that you kind of looked into the problems. So in terms of the discovery phase of the Bloom journey, can you talk a bit about that? I suppose you've already gone through it, so can you talk a bit about like what that meant for you, what you learned from that phase? I suppose it validated to a certain degree what you were doing, but what are those learnings and what are those challenges as well?
Yeah, I think so. For some context, I spent about 1.5 years doing research. So my discovery phase, and I would really say that the discovery phase is ongoing, right, to build a really strong product. But the discovery phase for me really started at home, literally at home with my own parents. And both my parents were immigrants. They immigrated from India and Taiwan to the US. And I was very interested in their financial journey and what it was like for them to come over, to open bank accounts, to get access to credit, and to build the life that they've been able to give me and my brother, which is a quite privileged life. And then I think it's no surprise to people who have been paying attention, there is quite a bit of a wealth gap in the US and of course in other Western countries. And that is really when I started to realize that, oh, this is, my family worked really, really hard, my parents, but there was also a lot of people who were working just as hard that weren't able to give their children everything that my parents were able to give me and my brother. So I just really fell down the rabbit hole and started to speaking to anyone who would speak to me. I was speaking to economists from, the LSE, and speaking to students and speaking to migrant workers and domestic workers and asylum seekers and refugees. And I think the hardest part is also the part that excites me the most, which is that no two stories are the same. Of course, when you speak to anyone, and that's the beauty of all of us living such unique individual lives, but you would come across people who had very specific problems, or their roots into the country were different, or the reasons for leaving their home country were different, but the overarching problem was still the same, which is that traditional financial services weren't serving them the way that they needed to be served. And I think it's an interesting one. As I say, I don't want to call our target demographic necessarily people in vulnerable situations, because anybody can be in a vulnerable situation. I could tomorrow end up in a vulnerable situation for whatever reason, but I think the target demographic of Bloom is a demographic that is very diverse in itself. So it can span people from different continents. It can span people speaking so many different languages, different religions, and that really plays a part into what we are able to build for them. On top of it, it was really difficult, I think, speaking of people in vulnerable situations, asylum seekers are often referred to as people in vulnerable situations. And that was really difficult to try and get primary research and speak directly to asylum seekers, because oftentimes you have people who are asylum seekers in this country who are, for people who are not familiar with how the process goes, and they are being granted accommodation here while their case is reviewed by the Home Office or whatever. And you often have a lot of charities or organizations that work to make sure that they are protected, that they have everything they need, but they also kind of, rightfully so, gatekeep and try to protect these people, because they are often classified as someone in a vulnerable situation who could become very vulnerable to scams or, other types of nefarious actors. And so trying to actually get to the target customer and speak to them and understand their journey wasn't just like man on the street going to like Stratford Westfield Mall and like speaking to a random person the way it could be for, a Barclays or a Klarna or something like that, because these were people who are a bit harder to get to. And then of course there was the language barrier. So it was certainly a journey for us as we approached it, but definitely well worth it.
What did I suppose going through that discovery journey, I've done it a few times before, and I find the hardest thing is to go into it and not have any bring any of the bias into it, which is, you have an idea and it's validated because you see it and you see the problem, and that's how you've processed it, you've seen the problem yourself. And then like, how did you go about trying to make sure that things like questions and research and like what different like quantitative and then qualitative and then face-to-face interviews, how did you find that was a bit of a challenge initially?
Yes, it definitely was. And I think it was to the point where, as we were building out our like user research guide or research guides, we really had to zoom out, and I sent it around to a few friends to kind of sense check it and go, I think there is a bit of my unconscious bias that is kind of seeping through. Is there anything that's jumping out that's really glaring to you that might be sensitive, might be pushing my own views onto them, or and even the idea of like asking about a bank account was a tricky one, because you don't really want to preempt them to talk about bank account. So we had to be even broader and like, you know, describe to me how you pay for things.
Yeah.
That was, you know, you really had to like zoom out of that, because actually some of them didn't even have access to bank accounts. So there was a lot of back and forth, and also we learned as we did. And there were definitely days when it was like, oh, I shouldn't have said that, because that might have led them to say something that they might not have otherwise said. But this is kind of always the thing with user research, I think. The other thing was just being very sensitive to, well, with asylum seekers in particular, you know, you never want to be like, oh, what made you leave your country, for example, because oftentimes people are fleeing persecution or death threats or whatever from back home, and in just frankly missing their families who maybe they've had to leave behind or whatever. So it was really very, very difficult balance to strike. And even things like assuming that someone had savings or had an ID or had a cell phone when they came over were just things that we had to completely throw out the window. And after a few, we started to realize like, okay, actually, we need to go back to the drawing board. And from that, pull out like, okay, you should have seen my wall in my previous flat. I recently moved, but it was like all these sticky notes and just like kind of main themes that were coming out, and then tailoring these questions to kind of zoom out and go, right, maybe we need to zoom out to the broader themes than try and get at a specific answer.
Yeah. So I suppose in that case, did you actually, going through that discovery phase, realize that the problems are much deeper than you thought? And you probably thought, well, they're pretty bad. And then as you went through discovery and spoke to various people, you were like, wow, okay, well, I thought onboarding was going to be fine, and onboarding is going to be a nightmare.
So yeah, it was chock full of interesting surprises and kind of curveballs. Onboarding, for example, I thought was going to be the worst part, but one of the things that I found was it's relatively painless now for a lot of settled refugees, thanks to a lot of the challengers who are using the likes of Onfido or Comply Advantage for onboarding. And so that was like a lovely thing to see in real life. But there were definitely things where, for example, there is a moving on period for refugees where after they are granted legal asylum in this country, they have 28 days to vacate their accommodation. And in that period of time, they have to go to a job center, basically start looking for a job, set up a bank account, apply for universal credit. Like all of these things need to happen, but also universal credit will take about 6 weeks to hit your bank account. And so you've got this 28-day period where if the asylum seeker didn't have any savings, and they likely don't because they've probably paid a trafficker to come across, or they've paid legal fees to stay in this country or to represent them. And if they weren't able to save any of the £35 a week that the government gives them as an asylum seeker, then all of a sudden they are often left with nothing. And so that 28-day period is actually the most high risk time for a settled refugee to fall into destitution. And that's where they're most likely to fall into homelessness. So these were things where I was just like completely shocked by. Another thing that I found was when we talk about financial inclusion in this country, you see a lot of great campaigns and lots of banks that are doing stuff with financial inclusion. But I think a big part of financial inclusion is just basic literacy. And literacy is, the common understanding and like the reading ability, reading comprehension in the common language, which in this country is English. But a huge reason that we were finding that people were being locked out was because they just couldn't understand English. And, whatever your politics, fine. And there are people who are making an effort to learn English, but it's still quite daunting to try and learn English as a second or third language, and then try and actually get into some sort of very serious, account opening thing where they're going, oh my gosh, what's all this small print, these T's and C's that are really, really daunting. So really valuable little nuggets that came out. But I mean, honestly, I could have kept going for years and years. I did actually think at one point I should just do a PhD because there's just so much here to discuss.
I mean, it's that, you know, you get those learnings and you have to, I suppose, hit the brakes to a certain degree, because otherwise you would end up, you know, pulling at every single thread, and sounds like there are a lot of threads to pull at, but
Definitely.
so now you're in, you know, you're in that design part of the proposition, using some of that discovery, that discovery foundation. What does that look like for you in terms of design, technological design, actual, you know, visual designs, proposition design? What does that look like? What are you guys working on right now?
Yeah, so I think the lead engineer that I've been working with, who's brilliant, the way that he's approached it was kind of like, you know, I'm fairly non-technical, and so he has a lot of experience in building kind of scalable platforms. And the first conversation that we really had was discussing, like, okay, what is it? What do you want it to do? But then also, what does the future look like? And in your wildest dreams, it was a really fun exercise, actually. Like, in your wildest dreams, what would you like this to be able to do? Where would you like it to be able to go? So it was beyond just like, oh, this is the first product, which is a digital Rosca, a money circle is what we call it. Beyond that, what's next? What would you, in your wildest dreams, like to add? Would you like to add remittances? Just rest assured, we're not going into that space, at least quite yet. But, you know, do you want to add remittances? Do you want to, you know, add investment products eventually? Do you want to, what are all the things that you want to have available to your customers? What does that look like? How does that work? And so kind of little brief chunks of like, how would this product actually work? But then it was also, where else do you want to go? So, you know, looking at other markets, for example, looking at Germany, where there is a huge migrant population, or France was a huge migrant population. Is that where you want to go next? Do we need to be able to build this so that it can be scaled to X number of migrants across the entire EU, for example? So that was a really fun exercise from the technical side. And then also for me personally, as someone who, you know, having worked at Bud and very much being a fan of open banking, thinking about like, right, who is out there that can provide underwriting, and having conversations with the brilliant team over at Credit Kudos, or talking to our friends at Trulay or Plaid or whomever about how would this look? What would this look like? And a lot of that was kind of bringing in my old learnings from previous roles, from a kind of visual design perspective, I should say. That has actually been the most challenging part, because when we first started out, we kind of just thought, right, I mean, I could show you these sketches that I had just done in pencil, and like, this is kind of how I think it should look. But again, when you're sketching it out, for me, it was like, oh, this is based on my assumptions from what I've read, or, you know, all the research that I've done, or how I've seen it done in other places. And so one of the challenges with our first product, which is a digital Rosca or a circle, is that it's already done every day right now, probably around London, around the UK, all over the world. People are already taking part in these circles where they are able to borrow and save money. But now the challenge is, now you have to digitize it, and you have to make it in a way that's friendly, that's simple, but gets across the information that's necessary for the end user, of course. And what about this product is going to make them trust you and use it, as opposed to what they were already doing, which was probably just giving each other cash or using PayPal or something to exchange money. And so that was a huge part of the process. Another thing I mentioned was literacy. And this is where I took a lot of inspiration from Duolingo. So I have, over the years, tried many different languages. I'm currently learning Arabic. I've done German, you know, French, Spanish, whatever. But if you are unfamiliar with Duolingo, it's like a language learning app. And the actual interface is quite devoid of any text. If you look at it, or if you just go ahead and Google it, it's very icon based, very illustrative and visual. And that is because you're learning another language, right? And so they don't want to overwhelm you with text. And this is something similarly when I talk about literacy, how do we kind of scale everything back, or really scrape everything that's unnecessary out so that it can be represented faithfully through or visually, but then also make it easy for us to translate it into multiple languages if we need to, with as little lift as possible. So these are all things that came into consideration along the way as well.
Yeah, and I suppose the difficult thing about the just on the visual design is that the demographic of the proposition is quite broad. So the problem case is narrow and defined, but the demographic that case applies to is very broad. So it covers geographies, and therefore it covers languages, and therefore it covers religions. I mean, the first thing I thought of when you said that was, well, do you default do left to right? Because most apps by default are left to right. You have profile somewhere, you have a menu icon top left, your most important menu selection item is bottom left, and probably your settings or help or things that are less used are on the right. What if the proposition is for a broad demographic? I suppose it's very hard, and a kind of balance needs to be struck. Or do you just do everything central, which I suppose would be an easy option, but is that the right thing to do?
Right. And that's kind of what Duolingo took a bet on, I suppose, where everything's quite centered anyway. But another thing that I realized as I did more and more research is that within migrant communities, so not just refugees, but migrant communities more broadly, you've got a lot of people using Facebook. So actually, Facebook has done a great amount of that educational lift for us into what UI looks like in terms of like educating towards a Western perspective. But I mean, if you're ever curious, like go and look at one of those super apps that everyone loves to talk about, like one of the Alibaba super apps or something. And in China, these super apps are like, for us maybe in London, where we're like, oh, we want something really sleek and smooth and like very minimalistic. Then you look at that and you're like, oh my gosh, it's like every icon under the sun, every color, it's like just rammed with text, and you've got blinking things everywhere. But like that works for them there. And so it's striking that balance has been really, really difficult for what people expect. And I often joke with like my dad, I went to such lengths to try and find like a really accessible, like great looking, typeface and everything. And then I look at like some of the stuff that people engage with on these Facebook groups, and it's like Comic Sans and like bright red on a green background. And you're like, all right, what am I doing here? So it does have its challenges, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I suppose there is always that balance, right? Because again, I've gone through before where you could spend 2, 3, 4 months just looking at the logo and go, oh, it should be this, but these are the principles, and maybe the color should be like that. And you do like 1,500 different versions of the same logo, then you'll get it down to about 50. And then you'll look at each one in turn and try and compare them to each other.
Yeah.
Send it out. But, there's a certain point where you probably think to yourself, right, I think, a few weeks spent on this is more than enough. Let's put a pin in it. And revisit it. This is the version we're going with right now. Let's revisit it later down the line, once there are users on the platform, once we can get actual, tangible feedback.
Yeah. And that's something that has been, for me as someone who's such a perfectionist, in my founder journey, this whole idea of done is better than perfect is something that I keep having to like voice in the back of my head, like just get it out there. It's not gonna be perfect, but like that's what feedback is for. Just get it out. So I completely agree with that.
It's a good mantra to have at this stage for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
And on the I suppose on the design, taking that into the design of the the technology side of things. I suppose there's a balance to be struck there, because you could look 20 years into the future, but actually, some organizations go for, right, let's just build it, and if we look at other geographies, we'll reassess the platform at that point. Maybe you go with an open banking platform that's not not widely available in the EU or across the globe, and then you reassess it down the line, or you take the other approach, which is just look at the complete landscape, look at as far as you can see right now, and then build for that. Has even that balance been
I think so? Like, for example, we're launching an MVP, and that very much is an MVP to get to market, to actually start testing it and have people interact with it. And that is something that I think was a hard pill for me to swallow, to go, everything that's been built, all this code, we're probably going to just chuck anyway. But it's useful in that it will be invaluable from what we learn through user testing and that sort of thing, and the pilots that we're going to launch. But I think there is a certain degree of that where, like, yeah, how much can you future proof your code base? I'm probably not the right person to opine on that, but I think that we have had to definitely come to certain compromises. And, the fact that when I was speaking to our lead engineer, Tiago, he was like, yeah, you're probably going to have to scrap like most of that. And that's fine. And this is normal. And he's like, and this is why I'm here, to make sure that we are building this in a way that we can future-proof as much as possible, but also to roll with the punches. And, for him, that meant Google Cloud, for example. And that's something that he feels comfortable using. And I defer to his expertise. And that's what we're going with. But I think I think we're lucky at Bloom that it's not necessarily a very like tech heavy business, right? We're not building core banking infrastructure here. So it's not something where I'm like staying up at night thinking about these things, but it is something that I think about from a cost perspective for sure.
Yeah, but I suppose, again, going back to your own point, those learnings, if you put a monetary value on those learnings, actually that probably far outweighs the cost of 1,500 lines of code that's going to go in the recycling.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I was going to ask it directly, but I think you've kind of answered it. The biggest challenge of this phase, would it be that that slight mindset shift from done is better than perfect, like towards that point?
Yes, absolutely. I think I'm also someone that really loves to be prepared. Like, I am your classic teacher's pet, where like everything was above and beyond type. I remember my seventh grade teacher, actually no, first my fifth grade teacher told me, and then my seventh grade teacher told me again, that if you do what is asked of you, that is average, and you'll get a C. So to get an A, you have to go above and beyond. And this was like just drilled into my head from such a young age. And so for me, it's really, really difficult. Like just today, I sent off a document to some investors, and it was, I kept going over and over and over, just like, what's missing? What more could I add? And at a certain point, I just thought, you know what, you have to just get it to them. And if there's something missing, they'll tell you. So it's definitely that shifting that mindset to what needs to be covered, and then kind of prioritizing from that point on, and not lose sleep. I mean, I am losing sleep for sure, but not lose sleep over the smaller things that can be rectified more easily.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm with you, because I was very much the teacher's pet.
Nice.
I would hand out textbooks. I would be I put my hand up for being the milk monitor every time.
Oh, love it.
So even though it meant I got the milk last, it was still like, okay, I'll make sure everyone has one, and then I'll get mine at the end.
Yeah.
I stay in class right at the end to help the teacher tidy up and like put the chairs behind the desks again.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I suppose even yeah, I think I'm with you. Even for me, that it's a long journey to shift that like chip away at it a little bit. You don't want to completely break it because it's kind of a good mindset to have to analyze things
Definitely.
and want to get them right. But
Yeah.
for this period of time, chip away at it a little bit and maybe like let some of the little things go. It is difficult.
Definitely.
Um,
Yeah, for sure.
so conversely, that's been a big challenge, and it's been very much your like a mindset shift. But what about the things that you're enjoying most about now? This design part of the position.
Yeah, so I think my approach is, as I said, like discovery is always ongoing, but I think with the design process, it's very iterative here at Bloom. And I'm always looking for feedback from whomever. And so I love striking up conversations with like random people. So just last week, I went in to Lewisham Market and just struck up a conversation with this Ugandan grandmother. And then she introduced me to these like two Nigerian grandmothers, and we all got to talking, and they all went to church together. And, I was like helping them, going around doing their shopping and everything. But it's speaking to them and like these little insights that I think that's something when you do user research where like someone can say something which is like worth its weight in gold. You're just like, oh my gosh, this is the crux of this business. But to them, it's just a passing comment. And you're like, this is the best thing ever. Another thing that I learned from a friend of mine recently was like, a lot of Somalis, for example, choose not to invest, but, well, they don't invest in the way that we might say investing in markets. They invest in gold. And as someone who's half Indian, that was really interesting to me because that's very, parallel to what we as Indians value as well in terms of valuing gold. And so that was super interesting to learn. So there's these little tidbits that I kind of get drawn out every once in a while, things that don't make sense to people that have then forced me to rethink things. So I recently did a feedback session on some of our user flows with an Eritrean refugee. And he was going through it and he's like, what does this mean? This doesn't make sense to me. And I was like, oh, I was kind of looking at this one section and it was actually the word withdraw. And to him, like, it just didn't make sense in that context. But the reason that we'd written in withdraw is because we just always, that was the word that was always used, And I thought, okay, well, what would make sense? What would be better? And he's like, when do you want your money? Like, he just like really pared it all the way back to just like, straight, blunt, when do you want your money? And I was like, well, I guess there's nothing that actually says that you can't say that. It's just not how we've ever really approached it before. We always have this kind of like higher bougie language that we use when we're speaking in financial services, but why not really just say what we mean and be blunt about it? So that has been such a joy and honestly is my favorite part of any product building.
So I mean I think that's great. I think getting those constant learnings even through the design phase is brilliant. And I agree that the whole process, discovery, design, build, launch, scale, it's all iterative. And in any one, even when you get to build, you're still going through those cycles of discovery,
absolutely,
design, build. Then you'll get to launch, and probably before you launch, you'll do another cycle because you'll realize, oh, we're about to launch, but we're probably missing, this thing that's going to really, really drive customer acquisition, or we're missing this thing that's like, oh, it's been a year since we started, and now the market's changed, the culture has changed. We need to and you'll go through that. You'll go through that
definitely
life cycle.
Definitely.
Would you say, like, this is a random question, but would you say like creative, and is the creative part of that design something that you're enjoying as well, like going into putting the button in a certain place or going through and trying to shape the user workflow?
Yeah, I think so. It's always interesting when in my previous roles, you're kind of locked into a certain like design system or a certain way of like, this is just how it's done, or like we are, you know, beholden to this particular flow because, you know, that's what we get from, I don't know, on Fido or something, whatever. But it's really interesting to step outside it and kind of reimagine things and kind of say like, what makes sense. So for example, connecting your bank account, we've been going back and forth about like, where are different places that we can place this? Like when is the last possible minute that we actually need them to connect their bank account? And going through and actually examining like, what do we get from them connecting their bank account earlier rather than later? Is it merely just to make that, you know, payment initiation? Is that it? Or do we get some sort of other benefit from connecting their bank account earlier? Reimagining how they can interact with that is really great as well. And then also getting creative in terms of blending the lines of physical and digital, because I think our demographic still is so much in the physical world. They very much still enjoy using cash. They like the anonymity of cash. They like, but not just that, they meet in physical spaces. They form community in physical spaces. So how do we kind of blur those lines and be your trusty sidekick, you know, in your pocket, but also complement the existing physical communities in which they live?
I think it sounds like that's the right, like the perfect word, to complement rather than to overtake.
Absolutely.
We're replacing cash, and don't bother buying gold, just buy gold shares.
Yeah,
it's like, yeah, that complementary.
Definitely.
So I suppose if there was, you know, you had to give advice to someone else who was either just finishing off their discovery phase and entering design, what bit of advice would you give them?
I think honestly, it is what you just pointed out earlier, where, you know, this iterative process. I think I recently, because I've been fundraising, I stepped away from the customer. And there's a reason that you're constantly being told to like speak to your customer, like as much as possible, because the signals start to get really mixed quite quickly. Because what an investor wants to see is very different from what your customer often wants to see, right? And so I realized that I was drifting far away from what the customer wanted and why we were doing all of this to begin with, and kind of almost falling into that trap of letting an investor dictate your product roadmap. And so, you know, while, you know, there's a certain amount of flexibility that we all need to have when fundraising and when working with our investors, there is also a lot to be said of sticking close to your customer, remembering why you're there, going back to the problem. What is it that we're trying to solve? And honestly, like, explain it to your parents. So, you know, especially in the design phase, like, if you can't explain it to your parents, then something's wrong, I think. I mean, even if you're like, my parents are in their 60s, even if they're not your target demographic, if you can't like strip it back and explain to them what is happening or why they need to click that button or why that's there, like maybe you need to re-examine why it's there in the first place.
I think that's a brilliant piece of advice. I think I agree. I try to explain to my parents what I do, but it ends up going over more than 2 sentences, so they lose interest.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. But if you can keep their attention, then definitely ask them.
Yeah, if they understand it's something to do with computers and something bank or money, then they're like, okay, well, you kind of get it. You kind of get it.
Yeah, exactly. That's all they need to know.
Yeah. I suppose just going on from that advice, you know, being able to explain it simply. Do you think that's why having, you know, company object, like that high level 1 sentence, what is Bloom, and also those North Star metrics, you know, sometimes they get slated like this, what is your North Star metric? But do you think that there's like that kind of validates why those those things exist, especially a North Star, because it's supposed to be very, very, very tightly linked to what your company and what your proposition objective is. And then all your other, all your other measures kind of precipitate from that one thing that your product team, your design team, your engineering team look at and go, right, this is the objective. So we build towards this objective however we can.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way of putting it. And hopefully in your discovery phase, you've done enough to really have a strong North Star and know exactly why you're doing what you're doing. Yeah,
exactly. Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for your time. I'm hyped up and really excited to see what comes out of Bloom. And when have you got an idea of timelines? Are you still...
I'm gonna keep it very close to my chest for now, but you'll be the first to know. We are currently just, I guess, what's the word? Everyone always jokes about it on Twitter. We're heads down building, but we actually are. So it's a really nice feeling to be heads down building, and hopefully doing some good along the way as well.
Great.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much.
And hopefully we'll speak again soon.
For sure. Awesome. Thanks a lot, Nina.
Amazing.
Thank you.
All right.